This is intriguing. You're basically at the mercy of using DLSS or FSR for this game. Upscaling technologies seem to be all the buzz these days in the PC gaming tech world. Whether it's Nvidia's DLSS or AMD's FSR, both of these upscaling features are available in a wide variety of games, and in my opinion, they have become a welcome addition to allow the user to optimize their experience. Yet these days I feel like gamers and more so developers are starting to become more reliant on these techniques to combat poor optimization, kind of like a quick band-aid fix. Could we perhaps be looking at a future where in order to attain playable frame rates, upscaling is mandatory? Let's discuss that in this video. Hey, if you enjoy content like this, drop a like, make sure to subscribe, and smash that bell so you never miss another video. Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. Bethesda just recently dropped Starfield, a game that was highly anticipated for quite some time. If you've played and enjoyed games like The Elder Scrolls Skyrim and Fallout, this is supposed to deliver that classic Bethesda experience, but this time we're in space. However, since this game came out in early access, I've been hearing a lot about it from the PC gaming tech community about how people are struggling to attain decent performance with their hardware, and I thought to myself, well, isn't this a surprise? Another game released for 2023 that seems to be bringing GPUs and CPUs to their knees. So I thought I'd do some testing with Starfield on my test bench, which has some really high-end hardware to see how the game performs. For a quick rundown, we've got an Intel Core i9-13900K which has its P cores overclocked to 5.6 GHz, E cores at 4.5 GHz, and its cache at 5 GHz, paired with 32 GB of Team Group T-Create DDR5 memory, which is running at 7200 megatransfers with manually tuned timings, and an RTX 4090, also overclocked, which runs comfortably at 3 GHz, and its memory at 24 gigabits per second. So it really doesn't get much better than this when it comes to hardware. I'll leave the rest of the specs in the video description. Since the monitor I was using has a native resolution of 1440p, I thought I'd start off with that resolution using the Ultra preset. It says custom because I've disabled depth of field and some other effects, but what is interesting is that when I first selected the Ultra preset, by default it turned on FSR2 and variable rate shading. FSR2 is AMD's developed upscaling technology that also works on Nvidia GPUs, and variable rate shading basically makes it so that less important or less detailed areas are rendered at a lower quality, so things off into the distance on the corners of your screen, so the stuff that the gamer really wouldn't be paying attention to anyway, to save processing power or boost performance. But for testing purposes, I turned those features off for now. At these quality settings, the system was able to deliver well over 100 FPS. I'd say we're averaging around 120-ish FPS, which isn't terrible. The overall experience was quite smooth. Remember, this is a single player title, so you don't necessarily need like 400 FPS. Now with that said, I was a little surprised to see this kind of performance from a 4090 in this game, because at 1440p and other titles which have looked just as good, if not better in some cases, performance was considerably better. Now keeping those same settings, I decided to bump up the resolution to 4K to see what the performance would be like. I think a lot of owners of this $1,600 GPU are playing at this resolution, whether that's on a 4K monitor or maybe an OLED like me. But we can immediately see a drastic drop in performance using those settings. We're still getting a very playable experience around 80 to 90 FPS, but if you were to ask me personally, the visuals don't really justify the way this game performs. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it looks terrible. I think it looks quite good, but it's certainly not what I'd call earth-shattering graphics or next-gen. Now, if you've been a follower on my channel for a while now, you'll know that I'm someone who always recommends playing with a mixture of settings, as I think playing with everything maxed or ultra is kind of dumb. There are a lot of effects which drastically hurt performance at ultra settings, but visually don't look noticeably better than their high or medium presets. So using a mixture of medium and high settings, we seem to get a nice little performance bump. We're now hovering around that low to mid 90 FPS range. However, I also like to play my single player titles on a 4K 120Hz OLED, and ideally would like to get performance around that 120 FPS threshold. Therefore, I wanted to see if we could reach that target using upscaling. With FSR2 now enabled using the quality mode, we finally get there. And in this game, it doesn't actually have any set presets for the FSR technology. You have to play around with the render resolution scale. Quality mode is 66% of native resolution. But with with this configuration, we're now averaging around 120 FPS, and it feels as smooth as it did when I was playing at 1440p, albeit we were using higher quality settings. Nonetheless, we got to our performance target, but we needed an upscaling feature enabled in order to get there, and also had to reduce settings. From the 4090, I was expecting more performance even at 4K because, as I've said earlier, there's been plenty of other games which look just as good and perform a lot better. Now, you're probably like, well, that's great and all, but you're playing at 4K with a $1,600 GPU. You're basically just brute forcing with your high-end graphics card, which only a small niche crowd will have a configuration like this. And you're right. So here's my RTX 2080. This is the EVGA XC gaming model, and I thought I'd test with this card as it's also listed as a GPU in the recommended specs, although on the AMD side they state RX 6800 XT, which is in a totally different tier. I have a feeling they made a typo and it was supposed to say RTX 3080. But the 2080 here will represent a scenario using a modern lower-end graphics card like the RTX 3060 Ti or perhaps an RX 6700. Anyways, with the RTX 2080 in the test bench, I decided to start off testing at 1440p using high settings, and here we can see that we're sitting in the low to mid 40s, which you could pass off as playable. I think the consoles are running this game at a locked 30 FPS, so do with that what you will, but I personally don't think this is the ideal way to play. And by the way, this GPU is overclocked too. The RTX 2080, when it was released 5 years ago, was considered a high-end GPU. It launched at around $700, but with markups was around $800, and back then had no problems gaming at 1440p and could do some 4K gaming. However, as these GPUs age and more new titles come out with more advanced graphics and tech, you basically expect them to fall off. However, for a game that looks like this, I was expecting a 2080 should have been able to comfortably do 60 FPS even with high settings, at 1440p at least. Alright, so high settings, this GPU clearly struggles, so I decided to drop down the settings and play with a mixture of medium, high, and low settings. And what's interesting is that while we see performance increase, it's nothing drastic, probably like 5%, and at this point we can either drop down to 1080p or use upscaling, so I opted for the latter here, again using FSR2 at the quality preset, and we can see that we're hovering around that 60 FPS mark, and it's a lot more smoother for sure. The upscaling implementation here isn't bad. Visually, from what I can see, it looks like it has barely degraded in quality. I'm sure if I was to stop and start zooming in on my recorded footage, I could probably see some differences, but who's really playing their games like that? On that note though, there was a pretty good video made by a YouTube channel called MX Benchmark PC, and they were able to mod DLSS 3.5 into the game and found that it was not just better than FSR2 using the quality preset, but also better looking than native, which is quite interesting. With that said, we found ourselves again having to rely on an upscaling feature to help improve and optimize performance to get us to a sensible target. Later on, I did also drop down the resolution to 1080p using the same medium mixed settings, and I found that performance was about the same, if not just slightly better than what we got with 1440p upscaled. However, the game did look noticeably worse. The thing with Starfield is that it doesn't even have ray tracing or path traced lighting, reflections, or even shadows to justify the bad performance. Cyberpunk 2077 is an almost 3-year-old game now, but I would argue in some ways, without even using ray tracing, the game looks better and ran better than Starfield. So it really just comes down to poor optimization and the fact that when choosing different quality presets, I saw FSR2 and variable ray shading get turned on, which means the devs are trying to hide behind it using upscaling methods. Shifting our focus away from Starfield, and I wanted to show you guys another game which came out recently, and that was Remnant 2. This game runs on Unreal Engine 5. It doesn't include ray tracing nor lumen, but does use nanite. At 1440p using ultra settings, our RTX 4090 does a pretty good job maintaining a frame rate around 140 FPS, and it does feel pretty smooth. Interestingly though, using a mixture of settings with some settings turned down to high or low, I thought performance would have improved noticeably, but it barely does, which makes me believe we were running into a CPU bottleneck. At 4K with the same settings, performance drops down significantly, where now we're seeing our average frame rate drop down to the mid to high 80s. Again, it's nothing terrible, definitely still playable, but I was looking at this game and again finding myself wondering what justifies this performance. Like Starfield, it's a good looking game, but it's not what I'd consider to be next gen. You take a look at a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, which was a last gen console port released in 2018, 2018, visually looks just as good as the other two games we looked at, and without upscaling runs much better at 4K using ultra settings on the 4090. Remnant 2, unlike Starfield, does support Nvidia's DLSS upscaling tech, and using the quality mode allows us to attain an average frame rate around the 120 FPS mark, which is ideal for someone like me who likes to play on a 4K 120Hz OLED. But you see how, again, we had to utilize upscaling in order to reach that performance target. What about the RTX 2080, a GPU which today represents the experience a mainstream consumer would get? Using medium and low settings, we can see that the RTX 2080 averages around 60 FPS, which is okay. The game is still very playable, and visually, it doesn't look that much worse than when we were running ultra and high settings. However, I would have liked to have a bit more performance, and so using DLSS quality, we're able to get a nice little bump in performance at around that 70 to 80 FPS mark. But I just find it somewhat mind-boggling that in 2023, for games that don't look a whole lot better than what we got 5 or 6 years ago, we're having to turn down settings to low or medium and utilize upscaling to attain an acceptable level of performance. This to me just screams lazy development and poor optimization. And circling back to Starfield, this was a game I had high hopes for because I had heard that Bethesda was going to get assistance from the devs over at id Software, developers of Doom Eternal. Doom Eternal is what I consider to be the gold standard of optimization, and if you've ever taken a look at its settings menu, you'll find tons of settings you can tweak, and even maxed out, the game runs like a total dream on older hardware. So when I had heard they were getting help, I was quite optimistic that this would be a fairly well optimized game. But just take a look at Starfield's settings menu. There's no brightness slider, nothing for a field of view, there's no texture quality settings, you can't even run the game in exclusive full screen mode. Those things being absent from a game being released in 2023 is absolutely pathetic and unacceptable. And what I was also disappointed about was to find none of the big review outlets calling them out on this. This year, there have been a number of titles which have come out that seem to have warranted the use of upscaling tech or even frame generation in order to attain a much smoother and more playable experience, and this to me comes off as developers now relying on gamers being forced to use those options in order to make their games run at a playable frame rate with acceptable settings. The developers of Remnant 2 straight up said that when they designed this game, they made it with upscaling in mind. Daniel Owen on his channel recently made a video showcasing performance in Immortals of Avium, another game developed on Unreal Engine 5 using Nanite and also Lumen, a realistic lighting system, and when he tested performance of this game using an RTX 4060, he was using all low settings at 1080p to attain an average frame rate above 60 FPS, a new $300 GPU released in 2023, and you have to use low settings, upscaling, or even frame generation in order to use higher quality visuals or get a playable frame rate. This is also Nvidia's fault for releasing an underpowered GPU from the start and trying to pass off an RTX 4050 as a 4060, but the point still stands. It's a shame. When Nvidia had first introduced DLSS back in 2018, they announced it alongside their ray tracing capable GPUs. A lot of the marketing back then surrounding DLSS involved you using it with extremely graphical demanding features like ray tracing to help compensate for the performance loss. However, as I mentioned earlier, these two new games we looked at don't even have ray tracing. Aside from that, it's gotten to a point now where if a game comes out without that vendor-specific upscaling feature, the community throws a tantrum because they're going into this release with the mindset that it's probably going to perform like crap, and in order for me to attain good performance, I need DLSS or FSR. When Bethesda announced their partnership with AMD as the sponsor for Starfield, there was so much outcry within the community because this implied Starfield wouldn't have DLSS. Now, AMD have clarified that if Bethesda wants, they're free to add DLSS, and with how poorly optimized this title is, how it's missing features like a FOV slider, I'm leaning towards them just not caring. Listen, if an independent enthusiast released a mod himself 24 hours after for DLSS 3.5 and frame generation, then there is no excuse that a AAA developer with millions of dollars in funding couldn't implement this. However, this just adds to my point that now consumers want to have and use upscaling themselves going forward. And I get that there are people out there on older hardware utilizing upscaling to breathe new life into their GPUs. Looking at it from that perspective, it's great that we have upscaling now, but when you have to utilize upscaling on new hardware that's released in order to get a playable experience in this new title, then I think that's a problem. I'm hoping that this doesn't become a trend because I don't want to see a future where one of the main selling points for the game is how it'll let you use a frame rate interpolation technique, or they're advertising playable performance because they added DLSS and not because it was thoroughly optimized. What happens if AMD makes future revisions of FSR which only work with AMD cards or the latest AMD cards? Then that means people on older hardware will have to play with super low settings, or imagine if a game was solely designed around Nvidia's frame generation. The game itself wouldn't even work on an RTX 2080, only the 40 series, and that's it. Could we venture into a dark future where we start seeing hardware exclusive software or games on the PC? Well, I guess time will answer that question. In conclusion, the gaming landscape of 2023 has seen a recurring theme: the need for upscaling and performance boosting technologies like DLSS and FSR to make new titles playable even on high-end hardware. Starfield, a highly anticipated release, falls victim to this trend despite our hopes for optimization given the involvement of renowned developers. The absence of basic features like a FOV slider, full screen mode, and the reliance on upscaling technologies raises concern about the state of game development. It's disheartening to see these trends emerge where gamers are expected to rely on upscaling to achieve satisfactory performance, even on new hardware, especially when they don't look mind-blowing. Let's hope the industry reevaluates this direction, ensuring that games are not defined by their dependence on such features, but rather their genuine optimization and innovation. The future of PC gaming may hold challenges, but it's up to the developers and the community to shape it positively. If you guys found this video to be informative and entertaining, then leave a like. Let me know your thoughts and comments down below. Be sure to check out the video description for cool links and ways to support the channel, such as using my Amazon affiliate link. And if you're interested in seeing more content like this, then consider subscribing. I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.